Sweet. All right, we got one more, and then we'll let the real show begin. I'm not used to bantering. This is my first or second time with the mic.
We like to call this bantering from the back.
Yeah, usually I banter and no one hears me.
Backseat bantering.
Backseat bantering. It's a very risky move. We're gonna go drummer mic.
Can you say the name of the band for the camera?
Yeah.
acknowledging that we are all on indigenous land belonging to the Abinigi tribe. I'd like to also acknowledge that most of the infrastructure and institutions in this country were built on the backs of slaves. It is really important that we acknowledge that these things, if we are truly serious about wanting something better, something different, something fair. I'd like to welcome everyone here today to the Economy for All Town Hall. Thanks so much for coming out to this event, which is hosted by Rights and Democracy Education Fund as part of a series of town halls moderated by Vermont Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman. Tonight's events are also sponsored by United Valley Interfaith Project, Rights and Democracy Project, Vermont NEA, Planned Parenthood, and Vermont Action Fund, and Public Assets Institute. Please give them a round of applause. My name is Esma El-Huni, and I live in Hartford, Vermont. This is actually my town right here. Yeah, good. I am lead organizer with United Valley Interfaith Project, and we are helping to organize a livable wage in Vermont, but also in New Hampshire as well. As an interfaith organization, UVIP partners across multiple faith traditions and shares a deep-held moral belief that a full-time job should lift an individual out of poverty, not keep a person living in continual impoverishment and daily economic anxiety. At UVIP, we believe we have a moral obligation to support livable wages for all workers. According to a livable wage model created by Dr. Amy K. Klasnier at MIT, a livable wage for one adult and one child in the state of Vermont is approximately $25 an hour. We are nowhere near that. Yeah. Tonight, we're going to have a discussion about many of the struggles thousands of families in our communities are facing right now. And most importantly, steps we can take to move us towards an economy that truly works for all of us. We can and we must do better to ensure that public policies are in place to ensure that every single person in our community has the ability to lead dignified lives, where we can all have a chance to be happy, to be healthy, where we can all thrive. We are one of the wealthiest countries in the world, yet we have people living in poverty wages. There is incredible technological growth, but there is also extreme levels of inequality with millions of people working full-time and even 2 or 3 jobs, but still living in poverty. We see that despite spending more than twice as much per person on healthcare, millions of people are going without healthcare. And many people of color, particularly Black women, are even dying in our hospital facilities. Our communities face an opioid and drug overdose crisis that demands our attention, but needs to do without stigma or criminalization. We see our communities pitted against each other by race, this imaginary thing created with real-life implications for these imaginary categories to keep the class structure in place. We see historically marginalized communities facing systems of oppression, yet we continue to engage with policies that perpetuate economic disparities amongst people. We also see and hear scientists detailing how our economy and energy systems are destroying the very life support systems on our beautiful planet. We believe that we can have a moral economy that works for all of us, that's in harmony with the planet and all of the other living things who live here with us. We have an opportunity to address the crisis in our communities, and we have an opportunity to be an example for others to follow. We have a chance to show what human rights looks like, where we have a universal healthcare system, creating jobs and making sure all workers get paid a livable wage, and where we support strong local economies, where we aren't afraid to engage the topic of reparations, knowing there is absolutely no way to move forward from past and present without addressing the mistakes we made and are making, and to make our wrongs right. It is not going to be easy. But by all of us playing our part, together we can make it happen. So thank you again for coming out today. And please help me give a warm welcome for tonight's moderator, Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman. And thank you for participating in this town hall series and for sharing our vision for an economy that works for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Asma. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We have a number of legislators who I'll be introducing a little bit later with respect to speaking here. I want to again thank all of the great sponsor organizations, Rights and Democracy, who help put on these events all across the state. We've been to Bennington and Rutland and St. Albans and Hardwick, Virgins here. It's been really excellent to get around to a lot of different corners of the state. Speaking with folks, listening to you and your questions, and having a conversation about how do we build an economy for all. And it's not an easy thing to do, and it's something that a lot of the political folks who are going to be here tonight are going to be talking about efforts that we're trying to make in the halls of Montpelier to move towards an economy for all, and that would include an economy that incorporates externalities and the environment that is for all, well beyond humans. But at the same time, there are a lot of opposing forces, and there's a lot of sort of apathy, even still, out in the general population that isn't pushing maybe as hard, believe it or not, as we'd like to see, or I'd like to see. And one of the things that I've tried to do as Lieutenant Governor is actually keep going with the role of being an organizer while being in office, which is not really what people think of politicians as. And so sometimes it isn't always understood by everybody what I'm doing. But what I'm doing is getting out to talk with you, putting out a newsletter that some of you may get electronically, some of you may not, but there will be a clipboard circulating around so you can get it in the future. To give you more information so that you can be a resource for your legislators, to help them with all the research and all the ideas that you want them to have, and recognizing that they too are humans in your community that are juggling their families, juggling their businesses, juggling their circumstances, and serving you as public servants with literally no staff. And so I try to get out and remind all of you that you are their resource librarians, you are their staff, because if it's not you, it's lobbyists in Montpelier, and there are some really good ones, but there are also a lot of folks who are paid by folks who have more money to really represent that individual or that small group's perspective versus the greater whole. So when I come out to talk with you and say, I'm curious, how many of you have picked up the phone in the last month and reached out to your legislator and asked them to do something? Excellent, right? So it's about a third of the room. So a lot of you have great legislators, but believe it or not, they don't always hear from the folks that like what they're doing. They often hear from the folks that don't like what they're doing. And it's really important when they're sitting there thinking about stretching their neck out a little bit and going a little farther than what they're hearing from their people, is when you call them and you say, great job, or keep going on minimum wage, or keep going on paid family leave, or keep going on climate change legislation and be bold and be big, that helps them get their neck a little bit longer. And you've got great folks here who don't really need that help, but it still helps when you hear from positive calls and not just the negatives. A friend of mine, a Chittenden County senator, put out a tweet a couple weeks ago that said, you're about to vote on Proposition 5, which we're going to hear a little bit about from our friends from Planned Parenthood Action Fund in a minute. And he said, you know, I'm pretty sure there's a whole lot of support out there for this issue, but I haven't gotten a single communication saying support this, and I've gotten dozens opposed. Then his Twitter feed lit up with people saying, I support it, keep going, I support it, keep going. But the media sees that stuff, and the media hears also what we hear. And so if those of us who are supporting good measures aren't supporting it with your voices and your calls, it actually makes it harder to do the good work that these folks are doing. So what are some of the possibilities? You know, I happen to think that in Vermont, we have a greater opportunity to do more than almost any other state in the country. We still have a bit of a roadblock at the very top, don't get me wrong. But we also had an incredible election in 2018 where we gained seats in the House, we gained seats in the Senate where we already had a 2/3 majority. We won a seat in Rutland County, for crying out loud, right? And so we have been given these 2/3 majorities, super majorities, by the people of Vermont to do good things. And I've now served for 21 years. So maybe I should stop and get out of the way for somebody else. But when I think back to 2000 and how fortunate I was to serve in the legislature when we passed civil unions, I think about how we didn't have a supermajority. And we in fact had legislators who stuck their neck out knowing full well that they would lose in the upcoming election. We lost about 15 members of the House. I think we lost a couple in the Senate, one in Orange County nearby. I think in Rutland County we lost a seat. Those folks voted for that knowing they were going to lose, but knowing that it was the right thing to do. And I think if you ask any of them today, as they go to bed at night, do you think back and wish you voted the other way so you could have been there a little longer? So you could have done a little more? I'm pretty sure they're pretty happy about the vote they cast and they sleep easy at night, having lost, but having lost for an incredibly just cause. And I was at a dinner last week, and I was sitting next to Floyd Neese, who was majority leader when we passed marriage equality, and he helped organize the 100 votes. On the day, or it was 99 votes, but it was enough to be 2/3, it was 100 votes. On the day that we voted that law into effect, overriding Governor Douglas's veto, just hours before that vote, his mom passed away. And he stayed at the legislature for that vote. And he was next to me at that dinner and he said, you know, David, when I first got there, what Obie told me as a legislator was, think about what issue you'd be willing to lose for. Something to think about for all of us in elected office. And right now, we have an economy that is not working for all. We have a climate that is crying out for us to do something. And we even, in fact, unlike 2000, have an election cycle that in 2000, the turnout, if we thought 18 was big, 2000 is going to return us to office. There is not the risk of losing the way there was with civil unions. So what I'm trying to encourage us to do over this session, which is wrapping down, and next year, is to be big and bold. And Friday, I was on public radio, I don't know who listened to it, and I was asked, do you support the climate change legislation around weatherization that came out of the House, which is a 2-cent fuel tax per gallon to raise about $4 million a year, so we can increase our weatherization from 800 or so homes a year to about 12 or 1,300 homes a year. These are good things. The Vermont climate change, or the Vermont goal with weatherization is to have weatherized 80,000 homes by 2020. We have weatherized 25,000 homes. We have 2 years left, 1,300 a year. For math folks, you'll know that that's not going to work, right? We don't always reach our goals, but this is a far cry from our goals, and this is Vermont. And so he said, well, but do you support that 2 cents? And I said, let me tell you what I do support. I support the idea that wealthiest Vermonters, the 10% highest income earners in Vermont, those making $150,000 and more on their taxes each year when they file, have just received an over $300 million tax break from the federal government. $300 million. Vermonters, that $300 million tax break, the top 10%. Probably not too many people in this room.
Oh.
Well, but what an opportunity. What if for the next 5 years we said, how about half? Let's take half of that. $150 million a year, $750 million over 5 years. And instead of putting $4 million towards weatherization each year, let's put 25 or 30 million towards weatherization each year. And create hundreds of jobs and weatherize thousands and thousands of homes and save working Vermonters thousands and thousands of dollars so that they can have money to put into the local economy instead of oil that goes out of state. What about putting $30 million a year into broadband infrastructure to leverage private resources so that over 5 years we put $150 million into broadband so that we actually do something that makes it so that young people can live in Vermont and work through technology jobs with clients through Boston and Connecticut and New York, but live in Vermont and repopulate our rural communities and not have people commuting to work, but staying at home, which is both climate change, drawing young people, raising families in our rural communities, right? Why not do things like that? So, and more, right? Why not put 30 million, we're searching to put another 50 or $25 million into housing because there's not enough housing for a lot of the workforce that the jobs that are open can't fill because people can't afford to stay here or move here because there's not enough housing. Well, what if for 5 years running we said 30 million each year, boom, into housing, and build that infrastructure for our economy so that it can work for all, right? Draw young people so we have housing that they can afford in their early years of their jobs, working for these companies that are looking for workers and can't get them to move here because there's no housing for them. So, to me, that's what we could be talking about. But we sometimes get wrapped into this small, let's make an incremental step. And they're good steps. I don't want to knock them as not good steps, but do the steps meet the scale of truly the environmental catastrophe we're facing, young people leaving or not coming to the state, and an economy that is not working for all. And that can happen when those of you that support this don't just assume good things will happen because we have these great legislators in the room, but you help them with the ideas, you help them with the support, so that they know when they vote for big, bold ideas that you're going to have their back when it comes to 2020 or 2022. And so I've been talking a lot about democracy being a participatory sport. And these great groups that have sponsored tonight, and I'm going to now introduce some of our guest speakers who are from some of these groups. These groups are the ones that are doing it day in and day out. They're in the building trying to advocate for you. They're going around the state door knocking and organizing for you. But if you help them, both with support or picking up the phone and being a volunteer, or just being in regular touch with your legislator, giving them your back, that's what's going to make their job easier to fight for you for an economy for all as well. So my first guest is Professor Annalise Orlick from Economic Justice. Amazing minimum wage. I bet most of you know her better than I do, so I'm excited to hear her words. I know she's testified at the State House recently on minimum wage, maybe paid family leave. So why don't you tell us a little bit about it, and then stay up here, because we're going to do 3 minutes each, and then we'll do Q&A.
Okay, thank you. It's so great to have these conversations. I was in Montpelier on Thursday testifying for in front of the House committee that's considering Senate Bill 23, which is the bill to raise the Vermont minimum wage to $15 by 2024, when it will only be worth 13 something. And so what I was struck by is two things. One is both the inadequacy of that wage in a state where you need to be earning twice that much or even more in various parts of the state to be able to support one person and one kid in a house, not facing homelessness. But I was also struck by how radical many people in the legislature I spoke to still thought it was, right? That completely insufficient wage, and people told me temper your expectations because a lot of Democrats, that supermajority isn't enough to pass this. A lot of Democrats are scared to vote for this. So I mean, this is a plea to people to be having conversations and to think even about maybe having to go up to Montpelier when the House is considering. The bill is passed out of the Senate already, but it may have a tougher go in the House, especially since the governor has said he might veto it. I think this crisis in wages that we're facing is national, it's international, and so I think Vermont can lead and be big and bold, as our wonderful Lieutenant Governor just said. New Hampshire is considering 3 bills, right? That's a state that has no minimum wage, right? So $7.25. But New York is ahead of us, our neighbor to the west. And Massachusetts is ahead of us. So I think we need to start thinking about how we move to that. And I also wanted to talk about the tip wage very briefly because I only had 3 minutes. But I heard really moving testimony from a waiter who testified after me before the committee. And he talked about the terrible things that you have to put up with as a result of needing to make enough to live on a tipped wage. Sexual harassment, violent behavior by overly drunk customers who you should cut off but you can't. And this is doubled for people of color, for gay people relying on tipped wages, for women. This is an issue of discrimination. Women are less than half of the workforce in Vermont, but almost 60% of those who are paid too little to live on what they earn. So in all of these ways, I think we need to come together. Childcare obviously is a huge issue in terms of affordable childcare in addition to housing. You'll hear healthcare, you'll hear from Planned Parenthood, but all of these things together are something we need to think about. And so paid family leave is up right now and it's passed the House, it's got to go to the Senate. Expansion of the child care credit is passed, right? But it now needs, it will need the governor's, child care insurance will need the governor's backing. So I'm just excited to have this conversation with all of you because we're small enough to deal with these issues of discrimination, and we're small enough to say that a living wage is what we really need in Vermont, and there's a long way to go. So coming after me, I think, is a dear friend, is Dave next? Okay. But I think one thing that's really important is this whole debate about small businesses and how much small businesses can realistically do, and that's something that we need to think about in the state. And we also need to think about what we're willing to pay in terms of taxes, because one of the biggest employers in Vermont is Vermont. Right? And so in a state with a lot of small employers, the state in various forms employs a whole lot of people. So we're actually going to need to talk about, tax structure and this taxing at the very top to support Vermont state employees earning enough to live. And finally, supporting union rights. Because in our construction industry, the state government, everywhere we look, it's one of the few protections that workers have. So in all those ways, thanks. We need to move together, and thanks for coming. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you. And Steph Pugh from Public Assets Institute, who, if you haven't heard, is really a phenomenal think tank on economic justice issues and really does a lot of analysis. Come on. I'm just talking while you come on up here. And super worth supporting, and I rely on them for a lot of data. One piece I put in a recent newsletter was that, the governor talks about affordability, and Public Assets put out some interesting facts, which is that Vermont, for cost of living, is about 1.6% above the national average, but our wages, our average earnings, are about 18% below the national average. So when you have a governor that talks about the austerity thinking, which is cutting spending, it's not that our government or that we're way out of line on the expense side. It's about bringing up wages. It's about getting health care for all. It's about making housing more affordable and putting money into housing, since the private sector only builds high-end homes. That was information I got from Public Assets. So I want to thank Steph and Public Assets for that. Please welcome.
So thank you very much for that. So yes, I'm from Public Assets Institute, and for those of you who aren't familiar, that was a pretty good synopsis of we are working to improve the well-being of Vermonters, particularly low and moderate income Vermonters, and kind of looking at what are the right state policies to make that work. And so there are a bunch of short reports. We like to do short reports on the back table, and what the Lieutenant Governor was just referencing is our latest report on minimum wage, and sort of talking about the way that we're thinking about minimum wage. And the way that we're thinking about minimum wage is, there's a lot of concerns about small businesses, there's a lot of concerns about different pieces of it, but the way that we're thinking about it is that those concerns will be there whenever we're talking about raising the minimum wage. So the question becomes, how do we know what the right time is? And that's really what we're thinking about in terms of what are the indicators we look at to say that it's the right time? Or or probably overdue, as the case may be, right? So I think what we think about is sort of looking at how families who are making minimum wage are doing, and are their lives getting easier or are they getting harder? And if we can show that they're getting harder, then to my mind that means that we're overdue for a minimum wage increase. So that's one piece. So part of what we think about in terms of the analysis that we do is also thinking about sort of what's not being discussed in the State House, what are sort of the arguments that we're stuck in, or how can we kind of sift through data to think about maybe some different trends that people aren't talking about that kind of get to a different angle on a conversation. And part of what we're talking about in terms of sort of the most recent federal tax cuts and sort of how they're skewed to higher income people. So another report that I'll just call your attention to, and this is sort of another angle where we kind of want to have a conversation that's different from what maybe is already going on in the State House and kind of move that conversation a little bit, is a lot of what you hear is that we can't tax the rich too much because they'll leave. And that's sort of this common myth, the idea of tax light, we hear it all the time. And it does in fact drive tax policy because people are worried that that's going to have a real effect. And so what we did is we've looked into it, even though sort of all the research of any tax increase ever sort of in the history of the country showed that that's really not happening, but that we wanted to look at it from a Vermont-specific perspective. So this is really all about what's happening to and from Vermont. And what we showed was that the top 10 states that people are leaving Vermont to go to, 9 out of 10 are the same states that where people are coming from Vermont. So it's almost a swap, right? It's pretty much a swap. So we talk about people going to states with no income tax like Florida and New Hampshire, and we worry about the Sunshine States sort of poaching Vermonters. And when you look at it, it's amazing how almost symmetric it is, right? It's the same 10 states. Our neighbors, a couple of the Sunshine States like Florida and California, and so it's sort of going both ways. And I think having that conversation and really sort of looking at the data to show what makes sense in terms of state policy, that's really our goal. So plenty of other reports, happy to talk about whatever else you might be interested in, but please feel free to go to our website at publicassets.org and check out kind of these different pieces and whatever might be interesting to you.
That's not fair. You're actually not next that I know of, but I can make you next. Sure? No, you can be next. Do you mind waiting another moment? No. All right. So Paige is from Planned Parenthood Vermont Action Fund and has been at a number of these town halls with me, and I really appreciate it because she's driven to Bennington and over here and elsewhere to really come out around the state and talk. We're doing amazing work in Montpelier. Your senators have supported enshrining in our Constitution's women's autonomy over their own bodies, which is great. It is now moving to the House. The House has passed H57, which is moving to the Senate. And Paige is going to tell us a little bit about where things stand and maybe how you can help keep those balls rolling and continue to make progress. So, Paige, thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about reproductive rights, especially when it comes to talking about an economy for all. Certainly when we're having this conversation, it's really important to think about it from the context of an individual, as well as from a context and impact on society. And when we're thinking about a childbearing individual, the decision about whether and when to have a child is going to be one of the most important economic decisions that they're ever going to make in their life. Having that ability to determine when and whether to have children can allow a childbearing individual to pursue the type of education that they want, to pursue the type of career that they want, and also be able to put a lot of time and investment in early on in their career so that they can therefore build a financial future that is really perfect for building a really thriving and happy family. And when we're thinking about it from a society context, when a childbearing individual has full access to birth control and reproductive health care, which includes abortion care, we see in studies that labor force participation goes up. We have more diversity in advanced careers. And we also see communities of thriving families that are able to contribute to the local economy. So in addition to talking about some of the benefits of having full access to reproductive rights, I think it's also really important to just quickly touch upon what happens when people do not have ability to achieve their own reproductive autonomy. And certainly, in thinking about this, we have plenty of case studies to show us what that is like, not only on a national level, but also a global level. In thinking about our country, we have states that have been passing abortion restriction laws, including, especially since 2011, over 400 abortion restriction laws have been passed. On a congressional level, we have a Congress that has been trying annually to restrict abortion access, as well as defund Planned Parenthood, which basically means restricting Medicaid reimbursement for services rendered at Planned Parenthood. We also have a presidential administration that has been passing rules to really limit access to reproductive health care, including rules around allowing employers to restrict coverage for birth control options because of moral and religious reasons. We have cuts in funding to teen pregnancy prevention programs, and something that could be enforced as soon as the first week of May, cuts to Title X providers simply because a provider mentions the word abortion in their care or because they provide abortion. So unfortunately, all of these restrictions, these rules, these rollbacks, they most disproportionately impact low-income individuals. They impact minority communities, the LGBTQ community, people of color, immigrant populations. These are populations that are, a good percentage of them live either above or below the federal poverty level. When they are living in areas when they do not have full access to reproductive health care, they may get into situations where they become pregnant, and they may not be able to get an abortion if they choose to have one. So if they are forced to carry a pregnancy to term, they have a 4 times increased chance of falling below the federal poverty level. They become dependent on public assistance programs. And let's face it, these public assistance programs are there to help a family survive. They are not there to help a family thrive. And thereby, a child may not be able to live the best life that they could, and thereby potentially keep perpetuating the cycle of poverty. So, in thinking about that, one of the biggest things that I did want to talk about is what is happening at the state level. As the Lieutenant Governor so well said, our legislators are working on historic landmark legislation to protect reproductive freedom as well as abortion access. The Reproductive Liberty Amendment, Prop 5, has never been done in the history of our nation. And essentially, they want to enshrine reproductive liberty within our state constitution. This would be different than Roe v. Wade, which I have to mention, our Supreme Court is now politically stacked to overturn Roe v. Wade. It's no longer a question of if, it's a question of when. So our Senate introduced a reproductive liberty amendment that goes above and beyond Roe v. Wade by saying that every person should be guaranteed reproductive autonomy in making decisions about their body. So, yeah. So, the other really big piece of legislation I have to mention is H57, the Abortion Rights Bill. If passed, this would simply seek to codify the access that Vermonters have had for the past 46 years. This is a direct response to the eventuality of Roe v. Wade overturn, where other states, over half our states, are working to restrict abortion access. Vermont is the one state that is working as hard as they can to protect the right to abortion. So, in thinking about that, and really quickly, the big thing is, as everyone, as the Lieutenant Governor so well said, we need to see more outpouring of support for both of these pieces of legislation. The opposition is so loud and organized on this issue, and they are but the minority of Vermonters. The Senate is going to be voting on H57 very soon, either this week or next week. And it's really important, especially here in Windsor County, that constituents hear from you. So I'll have this out, but one way that you can take action tonight, if you don't care about reproductive rights in lieu of all the other important issues, this is one way that you can take action for people that need reproductive rights protected. So I have this link, I'm asking people to take it, take 2 minutes, and write an email to your senator in support of H57. It really will make a big difference. Thank you.
Our next advocate, and then we'll get to a few policymakers here that are also with us, which is great, is actually one of my heroes, and he's going to be embarrassed for me to say that, but it's true. As a fellow organic farmer and one who is fighting for the integrity of the label, and one of the things that we fight for in politics is also integrity of the system, integrity of the policies that we're working on, and not just doing window dressing. And Dave Chapman, along with being an incredible organic farmer for a long time, is now fighting all over the country to keep the integrity of the organic label. So Dave Chapman from Longwind Farm.
I think that David mentioned earlier that it might be time for him to step aside and let somebody else take his place, and I think he's right. It's time he moved on and became governor. So I don't really belong here because I'm not an advocate for this cause. I'm just a citizen. I'm a small business person, and I have a friend who calls me his egg rabbi because I know a lot about eggs. And I tell him, you shouldn't buy those eggs, you should buy these eggs. And he thinks differently about it now. So I will say that Annalise is like my social justice rabbi. And she's got me to think about a lot of things that I didn't think about or that I wasn't aware of. And so I've looked to her. And she sort of asked me to be here, so I said okay, but I actually didn't really think about what that meant. So here I am. Longwind Farm is a small business. Oh, we have about 30 people who work for us. I think we have 2 part-time people who still make 14, and everybody else, you begin full-time at 15. And in farming, that's really high. And we actually have people who are genuine farm workers who are making you know, even $26, $27 an hour. But I think that it's an important thing, which is that this isn't just that I'm a nice guy, this is because it works. And those people are really skilled, and they stay because they can make a living. So it would cost me just as much to pay somebody $13 an hour, and they would take 3 times as long and do a lousy job. So, you know, there's a wisdom to higher wages. There's a wisdom to people being able to stay and get more skilled and be respected. And I don't mean that people who are paid a lower wage are necessarily not respected. And so I wanted to just clarify one thing. I'm not speaking for farmers here today. And I don't think that I can. I'm speaking for our farm. We are sort of blessed in the amount of community support for our farm. And I know that there are many farmers in Vermont who don't themselves, the people who own the farm, don't make $15 an hour. So this is a hard sell. And you know, this conversation is going on. People are anticipating this, and I've seen it. And you know, I'll just say that the one way I can imagine that working for them is if everybody in Vermont insisted on buying organic from Vermont. And not organic from Vermont, but buying from Vermont, because then people could make a better living. You know, so that's a whole different conversation, but it is a little bit a part of this, which is why is it that we can't afford, if we can't afford, to pay 15? So, I don't know, it's more than enough.
All right, and I was given this list, I think it's in no particular order, because if I was going to go in the order you gave me, it's okay, and he is first. But we've got Representative Randall Zott here as well, somewhere. Come on up. And say a couple words. New legislator, I think, having a great time. I did eke him out in the March Madness basketball pool. I came in first, he came in second. But as a newbie to the legislature, that's pretty darn good. He's more than just a basketball pool player, by the way. He's a great legislator.
You know, it's interesting seeing this this list here, because I'm on the committee House General Housing and Military Affairs, which doesn't sound like a particularly sexy committee when you hear it on first blush. But if you look at the minimum wage bill, that's coming out of my committee, paid family leave is coming out of my committee, and almost all workers' rights bills also come out of that committee. We have a card check bill in that committee as well. I did just hear from Annalise, the testimony that she was referring to actually was in my committee. And I actually just published this piece, which I originally was going to read, but it just doesn't seem to fit the vibe here, so I won't read it. But I wrote a piece about the moral economy, which also came out of testimony in my committee around the minimum wage. We had someone from Vermont Interfaith Action testifying, and he used that phrase, and it really stopped me, because you don't hear the term moral economy very often in the State House. Usually when you hear things about bills, what you hear is, this is what the bill will do, and this is how it will impact the economy. But you don't hear about the sort of broader philosophical question of, like, what does this bill mean? What does it mean for Vermonters, and what does it mean for working families? And my background is in the humanities, so the question of, like, what something means is a conversation that I think is really important to bring to the State House, so that we're not always just talking about, here are the talking points for the bills, this is how many weeks of leave that this provides, but what does this mean for a family? And in that regard, we had a legislative economist come in, and he kept talking about the impact of the minimum wage. And he kept using the phrase impact. He was saying it's going to have very little impact. It won't have much impact. And he was doing that, not particularly with a particular agenda in mind. He was just talking about the impact on the economy. But my mind immediately went to, well, what's the impact for working families? That's the question. So all he wanted to talk about, which is his job, in fairness, is the quantitative analysis of what that bill meant. And I wanted to talk about the qualitative analysis, right? Like, what does it mean for a working family? What is the impact on them? Not what is the impact on the GDP, not how does it register in a spreadsheet, but how does it affect the quality of these people's lives? And so that's sort of the piece I read about. You can find it on Vermont Digger. And there's one other thing I wanted to talk about. In addition to this other kinds of testimony that we had, we had testimony about paid family leave, and again, the question was always about the impact on employers and how it would affect employers. And we had that same, you generally get that same kind of thing. So we had the administration coming in, and they would consistently talk about the impact of these proposals on small businesses, and they sort of took it upon themselves to become the defenders of small businesses. And they ended up, and I actually questioned them about it, because I said, every time I hear like what the problem is, it seems like the problem is the worker. The worker doesn't have enough skills, the worker doesn't work hard enough, the worker doesn't have this work ethic that you were talking about. And I said, but what if we shift that frame of reference and we talk about these businesses, because you never apply that same analysis to the businesses. I'm not saying which is right, I'm just saying that both of those have to be part of the conversation. So when I hear a business come in and say, I can't afford to pay my workers that, I want to say, okay, that may be true, but maybe you're just not a very good business. And I don't mean that, no, I don't mean that in a callous way. What I'm just saying is, no one ever has a reservation from the administration about saying that maybe the worker doesn't have enough skills. They never have any problem asking that question. So I'm just saying we can ask that question in a totality. We have to look at it systematically. We can't just say it's always on the worker. The worker needs to go back to school. The worker needs to get better skills. Sometimes we might have to say the business owner might need to go back to school. The business owner might need to get new skills. The business owner might need to be subsidized. And that's one last thing, and I'll get off. Because we had a member of my committee who was talking about like the taxpayer shouldn't have to subsidize these workers, and it's the same thing again, where I say, well, one way to frame it is yes, that we have to provide, the taxpayer should have to step in because the businesses aren't paying these wages. But just as easily, we could say that we are having to subsidize businesses. The taxpayers are having to step in and so I know I've gone on too long, and I'll stop right there.
Go ahead. You do? Yep. I would have enjoyed hearing more. That was really good. Which is true of everybody who's been up there, but we are trying to limit it. Senator McCormick, do you want to say a few words or be up here for Q&A only, or you want to say anything?
I wasn't planning on it.
All right. Then we'll continue on to Representative Becca White. You want to say a few words? Someone's alarm is going.
Okay, I won't be long because I think I know everybody here. And I think I went to high school with the entire band. Thank you. I'm shorter than Randall. But I'll just follow up by saying, I think something that you talked about, David, was the idea of having younger Vermonters be involved and be more active, but also having the ability to live here. I grew up in a low-income family in Wilder, Vermont, and so that's one of the villages within Hartford. And for me, the thing that really frustrates me the most about the political process is I feel like there's very few low-income Vermonters or folks who grew up in low-income situations who can actively participate in the process. So so that's the piece that frustrates me the most, and why I'm really happy we're having this conversation. Because it's oftentimes a conversation that's really one-sided. And even with Prop 5, what you're allowed to do in the legislators, when you vote, you can say yes with an explanation or no with an explanation. And my explanation for the yes vote that I had for H57, which codifies reproductive rights, was in part that the folks who are most impacted by this decision are the least represented in the vote that we took. Because the individuals who sit in the State House, unfortunately, I'm one of very few who look the way that I do. There's very few people who represent low-income Vermonters, young Vermonters, people of color, groups that are typically the ones who are most impacted by the policies that we have around austerity or limiting rights. So that's my big thing. So if you know, this is my pitch, if I say this every time I speak, if you know someone who should run for office who does not necessarily fit the stereotype of a legislator now, please
send them my way. I want to talk to them. I want to have coffee with them. I want to explain to them why they at least need to come out with me for one day at the State House. Because it's young Vermonters, it's folks who typically aren't represented, who have the smallest voice, but have some of the policies impact them the most. So that's my pitch, and if you're a Hartford resident, you know where to find me. And I'm so glad you're in White River Junction.
Next up, a senator who is not shy. Your other, Allison Clarkson, who's doing a great job in the Senate. She also served in the House. Come on up and say a few words, and I'm going to keep grabbing another chair. And I know Coach is here. He's after you. See, she also is very good at not being shy, telling us all what to do. It's a good thing. We need more of that. Come on up, Allison, and then we'll have Coach Christie on that.
I have nothing really to add. This has been terrific, and it's good to meet you. I hear you're terrific, and I'm sorry you didn't come. I'm Allison Clarkson. I have the joy of representing Windsor County along with Dick McCormick and Alice Ninka in the Senate, where we have passed some of these things already. And we did not have you come to Senate Economic Development, Housing, and General Affairs. I'm sort of the Senate reflection of Randall's committee. And we missed having you come, and Kate Logan said you were terrific, and you seem to be.
Yes.
So I'm sorry we didn't invite me next time.
Yes.
But as you know, the Senate's passed many of these measures. We've passed minimum wage. We can't live here in the Upper Valley unless you're earning, if you want a 2-bedroom apartment, you have to earn about $22 an hour to afford living in this part of the world. And I would just say, when Steph asks, when is it time? It's like, how many jobs do you have to be working to decide that maybe it's time to raise the minimum wage? I mean, we talk family values. How many people are able to be home with their kids at night, having dinner and working on homework? You know, these are the issues that we want to improve the lives of Vermonters. Help them have one job and afford a great life.
Yes.
FDR, the minimum wage, FDR, just remind us, the FDR put the minimum wage into place. It was the minimum, it was meant to be the minimum amount you needed to live on. I don't know when the minimum wage and the livable wage divorced. It wasn't amicable. And we are now, a livable wage in our part of the world is really anywhere from $20 to $24 an hour. And it's heartbreaking to me that we are battling with each other over $15 an hour, which by 2024 is going to be worth a whole hell of a lot less. So it's a little discouraging, but there we are. I would say that the two biggest issues we deal with, when we're telling the story of how we're improving Vermonters' lives, we deal with two big things all the time: poverty and climate change. And those are the two issues that you could tell most of the story about most of the legislation we're working on this year. Randall said, we really have to translate every bill into how we're improving lives in those two capacities, because almost everything we do affects one or two of those things. We haven't talked enough about what we're doing to mitigate climate change, and that is a conversation we have to have among ourselves in the legislature. It is heartbreaking to me that we are not making more progress on that this year. I am working very hard. I've introduced a number of bills. The No Fossil Fuel Infrastructure Bill, the Global Warming Solutions Act. And I'm hopeful that the House is actually going to begin that bill and get it to us. They're having a hearing tomorrow night, if any of you can attend, 5 to 7, on the fossil fuel infrastructure aspect of it. But I think we have to be reminded that carbon pricing is important for us to own. We've had over 100 years of an addiction to a substance that is, has enabled the fabric of our very lives, how we have planned our communities, why there are even suburbs. There would be no suburbs. We would be living in brilliant sort of English design clustered, centered housing if we didn't have an enormous amount of cheap oil that enabled the design and growth of America. So we have to, it's going to be a slow process to wean ourselves off of that, but we are not even beginning that conversation in any significant way in the State House, which is discouraging, particularly after the New York Times Magazine articles last week with that one. Those were mind-boggling. But I think we have to be reminded that any further climate change will destroy so many of the iconic Vermont businesses that we know and cherish and love. And I think if we can turn the conversation around on carbon pricing into an economic development conversation, we're going to have a much more successful time, which is the Vermont we know and love will disappear if we don't do something fairly soon. So we won't sugar, we won't ski, we won't have, you know, the forest products industry, tourism. Oh, so many of the things that we rely on and that we treasure will be altered beyond measure. So anyway, we're working on it. And
our final quick words are from Coach Christie, great legislator from right here in the neighborhood as well, and an incredible leader, and helped us get through Act 1, which was H3. I'm sure he'll talk a bit about that with respect to an economy for all means all of our brothers and sisters, and it means also an education system that talks about some of that history, which is an interesting word in and of itself. The story, which is not just his story, but it's also her story. But we only learn about his story in schools, for the most part. So, Coach Christie, give it up.
Thank you very much. As far as the other topics that everyone talked about today, that's part of our work. Those of us that are committed to our fellow Vermonters, and especially low-income Vermonters. I have a number of buttons I wear all the time, but my most, well, there's two that are very important to me. And one is remember low-income Vermonters, and the other one is end racism in Vermont. And I think when you look at those two concepts, that's me. That's what I've been working for you for all of these years. And I feel that I've never wavered, and I never will, and I will continue to do my work for you, because that's what it's all about. As long as I can, and as long as I have breath, I will continue to do this work, because it is very, very important to all of us. You know, when I think about the kids, you know, that don't feel safe going to school, you know, we have a commitment to those young people. You know, and what is that safety? Sometimes, and usually it has to do with poverty. When you think about it, they can't afford to bring lunch to school. You know, they can't afford to eat after school. So if we don't bring that level of safety to our children, you know, who are we? You know, who are we as a state? So that's part of my commitment, and I think it should be part of our commitment always. Because if those little people don't feel safe, they're not going to be able to learn. And the more that they can learn, the better off we are as a state. Because, like Becca said, they're going to take care of us. And that's the goal. You know, it's kind of selfish. Who's going to take care of us? Those little people. So if we take care of them, we've got a good shot. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've got some questions, and we'll see whoever's got the mojo to answer whatever the question may be that comes our way. I also want to quickly thank, before we move into the questions, the engine room here for hosting us all today. So thank you very much. And if you've got a question and you want to ask it, and Dick is going to be a part of this part, please come on up.
Yeah.
Liz, go ahead, then we'll get the win.
Let's
So I'd like to ask the legislators, I think it was an amendment in the House to change the 2-cent a gallon gas tax to, I think, a 0.04% tax on the wealthiest Vermonters, as David alluded to before. So I'd like to ask you how you voted on that. I'm not sure it was voted on, and how you actually feel about that and what you're doing about it.
It was voted on the House. I think there were a couple of House members. That should be on.
Test. So, I took a unpopular vote with my caucus. I voted against the fuel tax. It wasn't a gas tax, it was a heating fuel tax. I was moving it from 2 cents to 4 cents, and I voted against it. I didn't vote against it because I'm against what it was trying to support, which is increasing weatherization. What I did vote for was a floor amendment, which often, if you don't know inside baseball, they don't have a high likelihood of success. But there was a floor amendment introduced by the member from Middletown Springs, which did want to raise the funds instead of from a fuel tax. They wanted to raise the funds essentially from the general fund by taxing people that made over $200,000 a year, and I supported that wholeheartedly. I just didn't think that it made good political sense to support it, and it just didn't. The idea of supporting a regressive tax, even though those funds are targeted, there's a long waiting list, and there's no guarantee that those people will ever actually receive the services, even though it was a small amount ultimately on their annual bill. But I'll let other people answer. Well, we only have.
You know, weatherization has always been, important. I remember.
So here's my plan. I'm going to propose it in my testimony tomorrow. And that is, we would really like if you could support a public straw vote on these bills so that we have transparency. Us folks working out here know. Of course, it's very embarrassing because some people will say, I will not pass that, and then their constituents will come to them to educate them. So I think what I'm asking for is kind of off the wall, but I'm hoping you will help. And I mean, what's the big deal? We can do this. It would take like 15 minutes.
Laura, every town has the opportunity to pass at town meeting a resolution, and we take those very seriously. We finally moved on recognizing Indigenous Peoples Day. We have finally, as a legislature, voted on that. And that has begun that began in Vermont as a town-based request. And I would encourage, that towns talking means a lot to us. And so when towns pass those resolutions, they have big impact on us.
And just to add to that, Laura, we have to give a shout out. I was so happy to be on the stage, but the amount of organizers in this room who have been doing far more work than I have for far longer than I've been alive, thank you. But that's a great point, Laura, because Hartford, for example, we passed Indigenous Peoples Day, replacing Columbus Day. We had a resolution around no new fossil fuel infrastructure in our community. And when I got those resolutions in my mailbox, I'm sure Coach can attest the same way, that's my marching orders. That's my town is supportive of that. So I think it does start very much on the local level for those types of issues. And especially like having Lynn on the Energy Committee, former state rep, those kinds of folks who I get your emails. Those little things really do make a difference, exactly as the Lieutenant Governor said.
More than getting them, she reads them.
And I would add, actually, this fall will be one of the highest turnouts. We always have higher turnout in presidential elections. This fall will probably be above and beyond normal, certainly with the current president on the ballot, and potentially ridiculously above and beyond normal if the person I would like to win the primary wins, who happens to come from Vermont. Yeah. So getting resolutions in your local, and there's a lot of great candidates. I'm actually excited that there's a lot of great candidates, but getting resolutions on the ballot this fall, and that means work this summer, or next fall, excuse me. So probably next spring is good because it's town meeting day, but even by then it's late. But to really, I do think turnout that fall is going to be a big deal. here in the front. I'm sorry, we'll come back, but I gotta go ready for
Well,
a
you know
shot.
what I was thinking is the time for the band, because I can, hold on a second.
No, the band is, we've got another 10, 15 minutes, I think, yeah.
So my name's Maureen, and I run a nonprofit, and we serve kids right here at White River Junction, at White River School, and I appreciate your work, because, and I appreciated hearing your story, because I'm a neighbor of Bloom Farm and a big fan. So at our nonprofit, we've been able to ask funders to help subsidize our work so that the minimum wage of our child care staff is $18 an hour and the maximum is up to 27, which gets to be in the living wage territory, but not if you have a bigger family, not if you're, it's still really tough. And I can also see the perks of having quality care for children and helping them thrive. It's all so interconnected. So I love the statement about the moral economy. I often think of the holistic economy. What would that look like if it was not driven so much by these sort of directive principles of gaining and growing? It was also about sustaining and nurturing and maintaining. But my question is, it's still very challenging to keep a small nonprofit running on wages that work for people. And do you have suggestions for people like me about what we can do as a group to help you and to organize each other a bit more?
Well, anybody want to throw something to any of the advocates either or legislators? Any of the folks who are organizing around some of these issues?
I guess for me, it's an entrepreneurial effort, from the nonprofit. I've been involved with a number of them over the years. And it's always been about, pushing it, and I know that might sound, patronizing, but, I've been there, I've done that, especially for kids. And it's always easier for me to ask for somebody else than it is to ask for myself. And so what I found is, like you talked about, having the partners. There are people out there that even if they don't know they're committed yet, you can get them to commit, and that's the key. You have to find that soft spot, in their heart, that part that you
Are you talking about fundraising?
Well, just in general, the
Yeah.
entrepreneurial, effort of a nonprofit. The first teen center in town, we happened to get started.
Right.
There's a number of other little projects that, we kind of stirred up that did the same type of thing. And I think that partnerships are key, working together is critical.
Working
in
together
effort.
in support of a living wage.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And I can recall, back in the early 70s, seeing, those efforts work even back then. And they can continue to work. Like was said earlier, when the employers came and complained about, oh, I'm going to lose my business. Well, maybe you need to rethink what you're doing. Maybe you need to find something else to do, because the average, entrepreneur, the reason that they're successful is they plan and they organize and they do things. So it's part of it.
I don't have the answer, but I would just add a little context, which is, I think this was part of what everybody was talking about in terms of their decisions on weatherization, is that those 5 things are not enough for an economy that works for everybody. There are so many more pieces of this policy package that are involved. And I think what you're talking about in terms of that $27 an hour, it might not be enough. It's not going to be a livable wage for a family of 4. But we don't necessarily, that's not what a minimum wage is. We don't necessarily expect the employer to pay more if you have more kids. What we expect is that our tax code and that our support system makes up that difference by deciding how much that person can keep, right? So there's so many pieces of this puzzle. I think we talk about, increasing the earned income tax credit. We talk about, at Public Assets, we talk a lot about a livable income. And I think part of the challenge of thinking about adding a regressive tax even for good policies is that it seems ridiculous to be trying to help low-income people with this hand and taking with that hand. And I think it's a real challenge to sort of figure out how the whole system works together so that at the most basic level, everybody can meet their basic needs, but then we also want to take it the next step, which is getting everybody to a place where they can thrive. And so many of these different policy pieces work together. I think it's safe to say that the child care funding system is broken for all involved. It's broken for the parents, it's broken for the providers, and the state's piece is not enough to make up any of that. So I think this is a big conversation. I think, these are some pretty important policies, but they're also, it's a whole big package, and there's a lot more work than just that involved. So,
To add to Stephanie's piece, I think actually the people who are not as well represented in the child care conversation is business. When the Vermont Business Roundtable did their study on child care and what it was going to cost, they came to us asking us for $22 million to pay for it. It's like, where's business in this conversation, Vermont Business Roundtable? It is 3 partners on that. It's parents, it's business, and it's the state. But business has to have a lot more skin in the game to solve this problem, and they don't. Business doesn't, anyway, there's a lot of business. I completely support Randall. My position always is that business needs to pay their employees fair wages. Business expects somehow that the state is going to be the safety net that's going to pay the piece of the person's income that they're not willing to pay. And yet they don't want to pay the taxes that represents those support systems. So it's funny, they can't really have it both ways, and yet they expect it.
Well, we have been since Reaganomics and beyond, but yeah. Rand,
I was just going to be needlessly abstract for a minute. But part of the problem is that we have an economy that's upside down. I mean, I was at a legislative breakfast, and this woman was asking about tax credits for staying at home and taking care of kids. And the thing about it is, it's absurd that if any one of us makes a decision to stay home and raise a child, we contribute 0 to the GDP. We don't register on the economic system at all. But if any one of us decides to go and clear cut a forest, we'll make a huge impact on GDP. And we have to continue to agitate for shifting what's valued in our economy. And it's absurd that people who take care of children and people who take care of seniors are so undervalued economically. We have to shift that. And we know why, partially because it's gendered, it's racialized work. And we've got to shift that conversation.
Yeah, I think also it's inverted economy in the sense that all the money is at the top. And Vermont is the 4th most skewed distribution of wealth in the country, which is considerable given what a small state we are. So I think Dave's point about buying local is really borne out in places that raise the wage. I argued with a legislator over lunch in Montpelier who said, I don't believe it, they're going to go across, they're going to go to the nearest Walmart, they'll drive however far they have to spend their money. But the truth is, if you're paying people a living wage, they spend a greater percentage of their income. If we can constantly say that and say, local businesses are paying a living wage, and a lot of those farmers aren't getting a living wage themselves, and just kind of encourage that. If we can't do that in Vermont, I don't know where we can.
So I just add to that, one of the things I learned from reading Annalise's book is that...
What's the name of it?
We're all fast food workers now. And everybody should read it, but one of the things that I learned is that the people that I'm competing with are actually not other farmers in Vermont, because I wholesale into supermarkets, and the people I'm competing with are paying workers less than $15 a day. And that is the challenge. And that's true for all the farmers in Vermont, because even if they're all direct sale, they're competing with supermarkets, and supermarkets are filled with food that is grown by people who are paid a very, very low wage.
A slave wage.
A slave wage. And that's why I think it's so important. It was so clear to me talking to Annalise about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and how the laws changed in this country as a result of that. And it was spectacular. But now, all our clothes are made in Sri Lanka or someplace like that, and they have the same fires killing the same people in factories, but the outrage is not here because the fires are so far away. And we're now part of a global economy, and it's very strange for all of us trying to compete with that.
Can I respond exactly to what you just said, Dave? Because I'm Joan Esper, I own the Fat Hat Clothing Company. We are a national business. We can't manufacture in Vermont because there is no workforce for us. But a lot of people can't afford your tomatoes, Dave. And it doesn't matter what they're earning. I have the same problem with clothing. So I want to just give a small little example, because when I was on the board for Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility 20 years ago, this conversation was the same conversation we had there. And I'm going to say the same thing now that I said then as a small business owner. First of all, everybody in my business makes well over $15 an hour, so that's been that way for a long time. And the second sentence of that is, who can live on less? Nobody. But I want to give you an example. I manufacture in New York City. So when the living wage 4 years ago, the minimum pay was $7.85 an hour. They moved it up to $10 an hour, and then all the rents went up. So the company that I have that is my manufacturing company there is paying the button guy who walks from 36th Street to 37th Street $7.35 an hour. All of a sudden he's making $11 an hour, still can't live on it, and if you know New York, he can barely eat on that. Then they moved him up to $13 an hour, which is where they are right now, on its way up to $15. So the company that makes my clothing has to charge him that amount of money. He's the low man on the totem pole. The next guy gets, so if you've got the seamstresses, most of them are men. They are sitting in a building that's a socially responsible building with all the right things. They're making $15 an hour. Then the pattern maker, or $20 an hour. The pattern maker is $25,000, $30 an hour. What happens to the niche market that I created? This is my 40th year doing this. I've seen a lot of changes. I've done a lot of public speaking about this. What happens to my goods? Suddenly, the niche market I created to buy my apparel can no longer afford to buy it, and that $1 an hour more isn't going to make a difference. I can't afford to keep making clothing in this country. I fight it. I not only make clothing in this country, I buy fabric made in this country. But I am running out of buyers because $15 an hour isn't a wage that you can buy my clothing at, and they can't even stay alive at it. So when we think about a living wage, we should also think about, in the same breath, without even air between, you have to say we have to change our living conditions. We have to be able to lower the cost of living. You can't say we need to increase everybody's wages, because people like me and small businesses around the country, small entrepreneurial businesses, Coach, because you mentioned entrepreneurial businesses, can't stay alive. We won't have nobody buying their product. So in the same breath, please start saying we have to do something about how we live. We have to lower the cost of living at the same time we raise, or else it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. It's not an equation.
So I think one of the things that you bring up is actually the title of our event tonight, which is an economy for all. And the economy, I think, as was pointed out, is there's 4 or 5 things on this list. When I spoke earlier, I said, let's put $30 million a year into affordable housing so that person can afford to live in the housing and have the disposable income to buy your clothing, his tomatoes, my pork and chicken and vegetables as well. And I got a lot of grief when I was running for lieutenant governor for the first time in the primary 3-4 years ago for saying, look, I'm a small business owner. I'm a farmer. If it went to $15 an hour tomorrow, my farmers have been around as long as David's. Maybe when I'm around as long as his, I'll be able to pay as well. But I said, if it went to $15 an hour tomorrow, we would go right out of business. But doing it over 6 years actually is a virtuous cycle that builds it back up in the way that we've built it down for the last 40 years. And so we need to be building it up, because as people have some more resources, a few more people will buy that local food or that local organic food, because now they can afford it a little bit more. I think one of the issues you're dealing with is actually more of that national or international challenge, where the world has changed since 1968 when the minimum wage was at its highest. But that's part of the role of government, is also to say, wait a minute, we have policies that have advanced import markets that pay unfair wages under unfair and unhealthy working conditions. We got Washington trying to push through NAFTA 2.0 to bring Canada down instead of bringing us up. And so some of us are fighting against that in the scales and positions we have. But I think your point is well taken, and I hope folks also do hear that this really has been an economy that's also pinched a lot of small business owners. And I agree with you, Randall, that more has to be asked of some of the businesses. particularly those bigger ones. And particularly those who are the folks that just got the massive tax cut from Trump. But the small business owners are working on a virtuous cycle and sort of keeping our fingers crossed that as we do rebuild the economy, we rebuild it for workers and those small businesses, which are the backbone of your communities in Vermont, even if we've also got this incredible disparity of income, as you just spoke of, which is why I'd say let's just take half. $750 million over 5 years. Think of what we could do for affordable housing and weatherization and issues like that.
I always think Vermont is so small, with 600 and some odd thousand people, that it could be, it's like 3 apartment buildings in New York City. It could be such an incredible role model for the country. And we just haven't, in all the years I've been here, which is almost 50 years, I haven't seen us take advantage of how cool we are and how, in this way, that we could create a standard for the country. And it used to be niche. We live in Vermont. It was niche marketing when I started this. Yay, Vermont. But I think that we could do that on a scale with our housing, with our health care, with all of the things. We're small enough to do this.
Is there another question? One last question before we wrap up? Yes.
Hi, my name is Linda Carbonell. This is really great. I'm really impressed with all of you and all the knowledge in this room. And I don't know if all of you know about Walking Through Life TV show, but it's an advocating show. And I would love to have anybody that would like to advocate for anything come on the show. And I know I've had a few of you up there as the guests, and I would love to have more if anybody's interested. I just want to offer that up. I have business cards and all that. But I want to thank everybody.
So in wrapping up, we're going to invite Dan up here shortly from Rights and Democracy. I want to thank all of our panelists again, legislators, advocates, organizers, authors, teachers, farmers. So let's give everybody up here a round of applause. And as I wrap and bring Dan up, I want to remind folks of a couple other issues we're really struggling with in Vermont. Mental health challenges, substance abuse disorders. One of the, I think, driving factors around both of those issues is about our economy and the struggles people are facing. If people don't connect the dots, that if you're struggling every day to heat your home, to keep your roof over your head, much less heat your home, to put food on the table for your kids, much less heat your home, you're eventually going to have some mental health issues. That is not a fault. That is not a fault of the individual. That is a societal problem. And so as we continue to have an economy that concentrates wealth at the top and doesn't actually trickle down in the faux way that it was marketed, the costs are coming right back around to bite us. And that's what this fight is about, is a society, a moral and just society, I think, as Randall talked about in terms of some of his language, that actually does value everybody, that recognizes we're not all going to be absolutely equal, but in such a wealthy country and in such, frankly, a wealthy state as well, when you compare anywhere in this country, frankly, compared to most of the world, how we have lost our sense of community values and neighbor values, and that life is more than a dollar. And we seem to have become so fixated, and I do think it really foundationally started with Reaganomics, that almost the whole political atmosphere we're working within that narrow framework. Those choices that they got on heating fuel versus for weatherization is all within that narrow framework. And until we broaden that conversation, as we've done all over the state with these workshops, which is I'm going to roll into introducing Dan from Rights and Democracy, who is doing this work all over the state to really bring democracy and economic justice back into the conversation. I want to really thank Rights and Democracy because they sponsor these all over the state. This is the final one, I believe. Thank God. And Dan, come on up and give us a few words.
Trip anybody. So thank you, Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman. So Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman has come all over the state with us and emceed in in churches, in municipal buildings. We're in a bar setting today. It's been a really wild ride, so let's give a hand to Lieutenant Governor for all his work. He's brought a consistent message of both be bold, but also hope and really pushing, and it's been really necessary in these conversations. I want to thank you guys all for being here tonight. There were over 50 people in the room at one point. It's a really good turnout on a Monday night. We have definitely, by at least a few people, the largest panel we've ever had at one of these things. So we're breaking records here. I mean, this is a great conversation. It's a great night. And the one thing I would ask every single person who's here today to do is actually two things. One, tell people that you know that we're here tonight about this and the conversation that was had. And two, call your elected officials. And we've already kind of covered that, but we can actually make real positive change this year. We have some great representatives who are already in the room who voted for the Family Medical Leave Act, right? But we have some senators who need to do it soon. And we have some great senators in the room who voted for raising the minimum wage. But we need the reps to do the same. And we have to make those calls now. And in case you're not, the person that represents you isn't sitting up here, there are a couple people in your general area who are not as good, especially on Raise the Age. So I would suggest if you live in Orange County, I know there's some people from Orange County here tonight. John O'Brien is if you live in his district, you should probably give him a call. And if you live here in Windsor County, especially Woodstock, Charlie Kimball is a representative that really deserves a call because he is definitely against raising the wage, and we need to let him know that that's not acceptable. So please make calls. Tell everybody you know to make calls. You can call Randall. He's amazing on this stuff, but he still wants to hear from you on it. Same with Rebecca. Same with Allison. They all want to hear from you. Let them know that you have their back if they're already good on the issue, or tell them that you want them to be good on the issue. So thank you all so much. We're going to have the amazing volunteer musicians, Jack in the Pulpit, back up here to play.